This program, while curated to help you improve your health, contains general advice and should not replace the individual advice of your medical practitioner.
You cannot shame your way into wellness.
We tend to be our harshest critics.
You have this amazing capacity to take from the universe what you'd like.
Vulnerability for me is such a beautiful thing to be.
If you're stiff and rigid, you break.
Trauma is something that I think we're just starting to really delve into.
You're not who you need to be when you're in this state that you've created based on symptoms that you're having.
You're perfect the way that you are and that you don't actually need the approval of others.
In life, it's normal to have ups and downs. But what do we do when we get stuck? I've always been fascinated by the healing journey. Why do some people get better while others fail to make the shift? In Season 2 of The Shift, we explore the intricate world of women's health and help you discover how to balance your hormones and understand yourself better so that you can truly thrive.
The menstrual cycle is a vital sign of female well-being.
My mum just used to say, "Oh, Nan, I'm so sorry. It's part of being a woman."
I would like a call to arms for women to know that their intuition isn't lying to them.
I'm Katherine Maslen, and this is The Shift. In episode 9, we explored the impact of stress and our internal dialogue on our health. In this episode, we're going to look at your emotional health and discuss some of the key issues that we go through as women. For many of you, this episode will be more important than the rest. It contains information that may just provide that light bulb moment that you need in order to make your shift. If you've listened to episode 2 of season 1 of The Shift, you'll remember that I shared my story with you. The short of it is that I grew up in a home with domestic violence with an alcoholic, abusive father. The net result of this was significant emotional wounding that took me years to recover from. I have been a teenager addicted to heroin and homeless, living on the streets of Melbourne. I've gone into some pretty dark places of my own psyche in order to heal and grow. I've worked with thousands of women on their healing journeys, and one thing that I've seen over and over is the power of understanding our emotional health, our wounds, our triggers, and how to heal them. There are some really powerful messages in this episode, and if it brings up anything for you, please call Lifeline or make an appointment with your healthcare provider so that you're supported as you work through this part of your health.
I definitely think each sex has its obstacles, and as women, we take a lot on and we put a lot more pressure on ourselves in some ways. And it's hard to say that. I try to shy away from generalities because I think everyone's so different. But I know for myself and a lot of the women that I've worked with, we tend to be our harshest critics. You know, I saw a lot of these people who came in who were doing fairly good as far as eating pretty well and exercising, but they had a lot of these kind of mental hangups. And most of these were women. Everyone I can think of right now really was a woman, but it's this pressure we put on ourselves. And so for me, it was really about changing how we see ourselves in order to change basically everything we do, how we see the world, how we interact with the world, the food that we eat, the exercise that we do, because as we start to heal this relationship with ourselves and want to feel better versus want to beat ourselves up to look better, it has such a different outcome, not only on staying power and my ability to kind of stick with something and the health implications on that, but also on my experience of it, my appreciation and how I feel in the process. I find so many people, so many women especially, and I saw this a lot at Nike, would come into me thinking, oh, I've got to lose weight, I've got to get healthy, you know, and usually they'd also be coming in to see me for something else too. They're like, oh, I have this shoulder pain and I need to lose weight, but I can't now because I can't work out, or hip pain or whatever that might be. We get so obsessed with that. And their first inkling would be to say, I have to run because of it, especially at Nike. And I just thought how silly that is, because there's so many other ways, you know, they're going out there and I would say, you know, do you like running? And a lot of time, most of the time it was no, they hated it, but they felt like they had to do that to be healthy. And, you know, I think one of the big things for me is finding ways to love ourselves and extend our exercise and nutrition as a form of self-care rather than deprivation and beating ourselves up. And for me, that's such a huge part of what I do with people, is really planting those seeds of how am I approaching myself? What is my purpose behind this? to me, living a purposeful life, whatever that purpose may be, each of us has a very different purpose and different skills. But having that purpose-driven life is so important so that, I can say, oh, wow, I am eating this thing to fill this void, or to make up for this time that I'm not spending with myself, or this sweetness that I'm lacking in my life somehow. And for me, that's the yoga. Kind of back to your question before, is being able to kind of turn on the light and notice these things. It's like, do I want to walk in my closet and pick out my clothes in the dark and hope it turns out okay? Or do I want to turn on the light and actually pick out something? And, it's very similar with our lives, is how do I purposely approach my food, my yoga, my exercise, my life, my work, as a way to serve myself, as a way to serve my community, as a form of self-care.
That was Tiffany Cruikshank, founder of Yoga Medicine. Let's talk about some of our behaviours and how they might be clues to our emotional state of being. Have you ever found yourself emotionally eating? Snacking when you weren't hungry? Eating foods you know are bad for you and then feeling awful afterwards? Or what about not getting any exercise, even though you know it's the one thing that makes you feel good? These are signs that give us an opportunity to tune in. Dr. Libby Weaver is a nutritional biochemist and researcher on women's health. I asked her why people know what to do with their health, but then don't do it anyway.
I think there are many reasons, but the emotional pillar in my work, I set out early on in my working life to answer the question, why do we do what we do even though we know what we know? Most people know what to eat to feel good, to sleep well, to have a constant, even mood, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they do that. I think one of the big contributing factors is what I sort of sum up by saying is not enoughness. So I'll pull that apart a bit. So when we're born, a baby human can't survive on its own. We need someone to take care of us, to meet our needs, to give us food, clothing and shelter, whereas other animals can survive on their own right from the get-go. So as little humans, when we're on the receiving end of the food and the clothing and the shelter, it's sometimes to alleviate discomfort. So we get hungry or we get cold, and then usually an adult comes along and resolves that for us. And then we start to link that to feeling safe, and that then becomes essentially love. So it gets wired into our autonomic nervous system, the part of our nervous system that we can't instruct with our thoughts. It's the part of our nervous system that determines how fast, how quickly our hair grows, how quickly our heart beats. If you cut yourself, you don't have to talk to the cut and tell it to heal up. You come back 3 days later and the cut's all healed up. That's all governed by the autonomic nervous system. So it's wired into our autonomic nervous system when we're tiny little humans that love is essential for our survival. But we know as adults that a life with love in it is delicious, but we can actually survive without it in a physical sense because we can get our own food and clothing and shelter. But for most people, it's still the pursuit of love. I could change love to be approval, really, because I think a lot of people link the word love to romantic love, and I don't mean that. That can be part of it, of course, wanting the love of your intimate partner, but it's not exclusive to that. So really we pursue the approval of others still as adults because it's as if we still believe that it's essential for our survival. And so I think that's partly why when we are on the receiving end of words telling us we're not okay, or when we make up a story that we've let someone down or that someone doesn't like us, it's why it is so stressful to us because it's almost like our survival is threatened because it's wired into our nervous system that love and approval is essential for our survival because as little humans, if the adults in our world stopped caring for us, stopped loving us and stopped giving us food and clothing and shelter, we would literally die. So part of, I think, as a species where we need to evolve to is to truly get it ingrained in our nervous systems that the approval of others is not essential for our survival. Because I really believe that when we stack, 5 or 20 or 100 experiences over our day that we won't even be aware of where we've perceived disapproval from others, that's what leads us to make unresourceful choices. It's just becomes so unconscious that we can't even see it now. And that's why bringing our awareness, bringing our attention to what we're actually doing rather than running on autopilot, rather than letting habits, I guess, run us, you can learn so much from those patterns about the beliefs we have about ourselves, and then peel it all back to see the truth, which is that you are enough and that you're perfect the way that you are, and that you don't actually need the approval of others. It's lovely. Yes, we're human. We all want it, but your life doesn't depend on it. So therefore, we don't have to go away and numb ourselves from the deep, deep fear that we're not enough the way that we are, and that the disapproval of others, we don't need to numb that with food or too much alcohol or over-exercise or overwork or whatever it is we do to try to prove our worth.
Reviews help us know that we're hitting the mark with what you need and help us to shape future seasons. I'd really appreciate it if you could take a few moments to leave us a review. I would love to know what you think.
It's what we take out of the environment into our own environment, so our inner world and our outer world. We take those things and be them other people's emotions outside of us and the food we're exposed to. And I always say to people, imagine there's a universe between you and all these things, and you have this amazing capacity to take from the universe what you'd like. And it could be a compliment. You know, a lot of people actually deflect compliments and Velcro the good, but we have the choice of actually saying, you know what, I'm going to take that compliment out of the universe and I'm going to take it into myself. And I'm going to Velcro the compliment and I'm going to deflect the negative. In the same way, we can be surrounded by alcohol or parks or toxins. And you know, we've got this choices. So I always say to people, imagine you've got a universe between you and all these things, and you choose what you're taking from that universe into your being, be it body, brain, or mind, or spirit. So how do you know where you sit on the spectrum? One of the things to do is actually it's called metacognition, so it's a bit tricky, is to actually be present and listen to the way you speak. So it's like that guy's comment I mentioned that he said it's tough being old. So he attributed everything to age. So pay attention to those sort of self-accepting statements. Are you self-accepting things that in actual fact you have control over? And the simple question is to ask yourself, could I do this? Have I got control over this? Or do I have choice? And I guess if you want to do a little survey, just sort of be mindful for a couple of days and see how many times you actually think you engage in a conscious decision versus habit. So, I do talks on alcohol and I say, about mindless drinking versus mindful drinking, and a lot of people say that they just do things out of habit. So if you find yourself doing something and you can catch yourself go, oh, did I choose to do this or is this just automatic? And, humans have amazing brain power. And one of the things our brain does, because it's quite an energy expensive organ to run, is it goes for patterns. And so it actually does like making habits because then it doesn't have to allocate so much energy to them because it's got this sort of routine set up and all it has to do is think, start and stop, right? And unfortunately, sometimes we make things habit and routine that we possibly need to have more thought over. And similarly, we can get angst over things like being stuck in traffic that we actually have no control. So we can invest a lot of energy getting stuck in traffic and actually give no thought to how much food we're putting up on our plate. And so if people wanted to think about how much control they have, is actually to observe how much they are making conscious decisions for themselves.
That was Dr. Nicola Gates, clinical neuropsychologist, researcher and author. Dr. Gates has been working with women to understand their minds and their inner processing for decades. You'll hear from her more later in the episode. I want to talk about emotional suppression and how this fits into the picture. Dr. Libby mentioned numbing. This is something that we've all done, and for some of us, it's an everyday behaviour. It can come in the form of drinking alcohol, smoking, or drug use. But a less obvious sign is where we deliberately tap out from life, although this often isn't conscious. We exist in a way that does not allow us the space to feel what is going on beneath the surface. This might look like busyness and filling every gap in your day with something to do. It might look like watching too much TV or being on social media whenever you have space. One of the reasons this happens is because we have trauma or past experiences that have residual emotions that we haven't addressed. When we create space, sometimes these emotions or traumatic events can bubble to the surface, and it can be very challenging, which is why we reach for our phones or food or other distractions. Kate Riordan has helped thousands of women to transform their health through her detox and fasting retreats in Bali and Australia. As a naturopath and intuitive healer, Kate has been helping people to rediscover themselves through deep healing, and a big part of this is looking at working through trauma. I asked her to explain what it meant to look at this part of ourselves.
Trauma is something that I think we're probably just starting to really delve into on a scientific level, on an anecdotal level, and also in the healing realms. And I think it's probably because we've become so deep in our healing journeys that we're ready to look at some of those aspects of ourselves. The way that I view trauma is the way that I view healing. You need to look at ourselves, the specific trauma, through a multi-dimensional lens. That means, how's it showing up in the body? How's it showing up in the emotional and mental parts of who you are? How's it showing up on the psyche, soul, spiritual level? A lot of people look at physical trauma, and for example, 2 years ago, I had a really bad motorbike accident. I came off my bike in Bali. A dog ran out in front of me. I was driving a scooter. I was going quite fast, and I had to swerve to not hit this dog. And I came crashing down and shattered all of my right knee, my right shoulder, and I hit my head. Luckily, I was wearing a helmet. And so I had a very physical trauma, right? It was very visible. I had a smashed up kneecap. It was purple. It was blue. I had grazes all over my body. I had gravel rash. I had a black eye. It was a very physical trauma you could see on my body. So obviously I needed to tend to those particular wounds. I needed to heal that skin. I needed to heal the joint and bone damage that was done. I needed to recalibrate my physical body, my kneecap, make sure that that was talking to my hip, that that was talking to my spine, through the psoas, through the ICB, everything. So that was a one way of working through that particular experience that happened to me. But what also happened was I had nightmares every night that I was going to die on that bike. So I had this huge fear of death come up. And every single night as I was going to bed for about 2 weeks after that accident, I would crash that bike. And I would go over that accident again and again and again and again. So essentially that experience was on some kind of feedback loop in my mental mind, and I was reliving it every single night. So I would be waking up in night sweats and just so traumatized by what had happened again and again and again and again. So I had to look at that aspect. I had to find that equilibrium within my nervous system that allowed my mind and that part of me to feel safe again. I had to really learn how to, just like you would soothe a child that's upset, to soothe that part of myself, to say, it's okay, I'm here. You didn't die. You're okay. Yes, you're in pain, but you're here. It's okay. And then I thought that was great. Okay, it took a couple of months, but I was walking again. All my wounds that I had inflicted felt great. I was all good. And then I started dreaming. And these dreams, I was always driving something that I wasn't in control of. And I couldn't find the brake. And I couldn't find the direction. There was no map, no compass. And I was scared and I was lonely. And I'd wake up and I'd feel good and normal and I'd forget about those dreams. They'd just disintegrate every morning. And every night when I went into that dream space, I would have these dreams again. The dream world is so fascinating because a lot of it, and Carl Jung really coined this term, that he said this is where our psyche talks to us. This is where our soul gets to come through and have a say. And so you watch your dreams and the symbolism and how they make you feel, because they give you so much access into that part of who you are. So I was looking at these dreams, and on a spiritual level, I was lost. I was going through a real identity crisis. I was coming out of one particular transition in my life and going into another. I had no idea which direction I was going to. I felt lonely. I felt isolated. None of this was felt in my waking life, but it was present in the spiritual aspect of who I was. So this quote unquote trauma, this motorbike accident, had triggered physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual things within me. I wasn't ready to look at that sense of helplessness, loneliness, or that feeling of I'm not in control, I don't know where I'm going, for many, many months after my accident. I had to really feel safe, feel like I was okay, feel like no matter what outcome happened, I was going to be okay. And then that shadow aspect showed itself to me, and I was able to meet it with the help of a really good therapist and a dream analyst and an emotional healer. So every instance that happens in our life has a physical, an emotional, and a spiritual connotation to it. And that includes the traumatic events that we have, or even the ancestral trauma that we carry, or the generational trauma that we carry. It penetrates all parts of us. So when we're healing through trauma, we need to really look at all of those different parts to truly get to the depths of where we can start to regenerate ourselves again. When you look at your whole self, it's just so funny how we compartmentalize it. And we only compartmentalize parts of ourselves because we don't understand. So for example, if you're like, yeah, I'm really happy at work, but every time you go to work, you've got a headache, your acne flares up, you can't digest your food properly, you're tired all the time. You can tell yourself that you're really happy at work, but your body may suggest otherwise. So to be in one's wholeness is this connection and communication between all these parts of ourselves. And when you open those channels of communication, you see how multidimensional we are. You see how that dream you had last night affects how your physical body feels today, affects what's happening in that emotional field. It's like when you're feeling really good, when you're feeling amazing, you've probably met the most fantastic guy and you're having awesome sex and you're just like, this is fantastic. Yes, there's pheromones and hormones and all these beautiful cascade of biochemical reactions that are happening, but your coffee tastes better and the sky's bluer. And your favorite song is always on the radio because you are open to feeling that love and that experience in all your different layers. And vice versa, when you go down and that black cloud comes over, it's going to affect your mood, your energy, what you put out, what you give back, what you receive. We're so multidimensional. When you look at that in terms of relationships and intimacy, what happens to one person is going to happen, is going to be felt within you, especially if you're intimate in those sexual encounters that we have with people. That's why it's so important to maintain not only healthy, clear sexual boundaries and boundaries in every area of our life, but keep those channels of communication within ourselves open. How am I feeling in my body today? What's happening in my mind? Is everything okay there? What do I need to feel more peaceful, to feel more loving, to feel more safe? What about my spiritual health? When was the last time I meditated? When was the last time I went for a walk on the beach and just let life flow out with that wave and do a little bit of an energetic cleanse for myself? the more that we are able to give and to fill up all of those parts of ourselves, the clearer the communication channels are and the better experience we have of life. And that way, when life throws us around, throws those curveballs, sends in those tsunami waves to knock us over, we can handle it so much better. Not by coming out the other end completely exhausted and shattered, but by just finding a slipstream and flow and staying connected to all of who we are, the love, the trust, the safety at all times throughout the journey, even when it's rough, even when those seas are stormy.
This advice from Kate is so relevant. What are the signs telling you? Are you getting a gut reaction about something? Are you asking your body how it feels today? Are you paying attention to your thoughts and your reactions? One of my favourite sayings is that you grow through what you go through. I really believe that our trials and tribulations can be gateways to parts of ourselves that we may not be able to access otherwise. That, as Kate Reardon often says, we can take the wisdom from our wounds and go on to be stronger and more in tune with ourselves. You may have heard of things like post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. This is where traumatic events create ongoing emotional trauma in your life. But what about the opposite of this? What if we moved through trauma and became stronger or wiser or more at home within ourselves? Dr. Nicola Gates talks about this concept of post-traumatic growth. I asked her to explain this to me.
Well, there's one thing we can guarantee in life. As I said, everyone wants a good life. And one thing we can guarantee is there's going to be one or more mishap, bump in the road, whatever metaphor you want to use. Something's going to bite us because that is part of the wonderment of life, that it can be unpredictable and things happen. And we need to accept that things will happen. If you're dead, you don't experience anything. So one of the things about wonderment and hitting bumps in the road is actually still alive to have them. So I always think that's a joy. So post-traumatic growth is when someone has experienced an event that has been challenging, but they take the learnings and the good from that experience and they use it in a way that makes them more resilient in future. And they take the lessons from that experience in a way that is helpful to them. So they've adapted to the event in a way that is useful. Now that is growth, that is growing because, you've learnt that you are well loved, for example, that you've learnt that you've got an amazing social support network. You've learnt that the medical system in Australia is amazing. You've learnt that you have the grit and perseverance to cope with pain or cope with grief. Or you've learnt that, time heals. There's all sorts of lessons we can learn from adversity. And it's about capturing those positive lessons to adapt. And, adaptation is about evolving and growing. And you have this incredible growth. It's positive. Now, I shifted the term from trauma because trauma is a little overused. Psychologically, trauma means you've experienced an adversity or had an experience that has completely overwhelmed you and exceeded your capacity to cope. And that is the definition of trauma. And that's why we get post-traumatic stress, because we're actually stressed because it's overwhelmed us. So in some ways, post-traumatic growth is almost a misnomer because we've obviously been able to grow from it and therefore perhaps it wasn't so traumatic to start with, but that's me being perhaps a little bit too pedantic. But I think the word trauma is a little overused in the sense that people might say something was traumatic when in fact it was really stressful. I often see people have been involved in catastrophic injuries. It might be a cyclist hit by a car and they've got multiple fractures to their body and they've had a brain injury as well and they've had multiple surgeries and things like that. I have had people with catastrophic injuries who have post-traumatic growth and go on to make amazing recoveries. I didn't say they go back entirely to everything they did before because how can you? Because you've grown. You can't step in the same river twice. It's a different river. Even if you're the same and you're actually putting your foot in the same place, the water's changed because it's flowed away. Anyway, so people have made amazing recoveries after huge injuries, and I meet people on a medical scale of the equivalent of a paper cut, and they collapse and they never have a quality of life again. And I can tell you the difference. You, as a clinician, you can tell the difference within about 2 minutes of meeting someone. And it comes down to the narrative they tell themselves. So they're either telling themselves this positive growth narrative that, things will get better. So they demonstrate optimism, or they demonstrate this overwhelming stress, and the narrative is about being broken and they'll never get better, and it was a devastating, overwhelming event. And personality feeds into those two things. Genes feed into both of those responses, and so do choices.
Mindset is something that is really important when it comes to healing. There is a famous quote from Henry Ford that says, "Whether you think you can or think you can't, you're right." When a patient believes that they will get better, their healing journey is faster and easier. When they have doubts or are stuck as a victim in their story, the healing is stifled. When I talk about being a victim in your story, what I'm referring to is your inner narrative. What is your thought process around what is going on for you? Signs of the victim are stories and inner dialogue that are self-defeating and affirming the perceived broken parts of yourself. This might show up as negative thoughts like, "I'll never get better," the tendency to catastrophize your problems and make them bigger than they need to be, or projecting blame onto others for your situation. As someone that has healed through significant trauma in my life, I know the victim all too well. When we are in physical or emotional pain, we can get so used to it that it becomes familiar, and we create a narrative to support us to stay in this dark or hurtful place. This is a really dangerous place to be, and in order to heal, you need to work on your mindset and inner dialogue to be able to change. For me, my healing really began when I could take responsibility for what was going on in my life and choose not to be a victim of my own story anymore. To do this, you may need to get support to heal through your past trauma and to let go of the emotions that you have attached to it. This could be a counsellor, psychologist, psychotherapist, hypnotherapist, kinesiologist, or any other modality that helps you to identify where you're at and to process the past trauma or stuck emotions. If you want a scientific example of how powerful this is, take a look at the placebo effect. We know that when we give a patient a medication, that a certain percentage of their recovery will be placebo, which means it comes from their mind and not from the medication. Studies control for this phenomenon, seeing it as a bad thing. I think placebo is excellent, and we need to be able to harness it as part of our healing. If we can think ourselves better, why wouldn't we? Conversely, you have the nocebo effect, and this is where patients who are given a dummy drug will experience side effects as if they were taking the drug. So we can think ourselves healthy and we can think ourselves unwell. I talk about this in my book, Get Well, Stay Well. Dr. Jay Davidson is an integrative chiropractor from Puerto Rico. He works with patients with stealth infections such as Lyme disease, an issue which is complex and debilitating for many people. I asked him what people need to shift when they've been stuck for a while.
One of them is identity. This identity that, let's say, you were diagnosed with, I have hormonal issues. It's my thyroid. I have adrenal fatigue. Well, you start giving yourself these definitions and you start saying, I am adrenal fatigue, right? I have it. I am it. So then you start identifying with it. And if you were to get rid of the quote unquote adrenal fatigue, which could be a whole nother discussion, and I would say it's mitochondrial dysfunction. But if you were to quote unquote get rid of those symptoms, could you even envision what your identity would be without that? And if you can't, how are you ever going to get well? Because you're always going to come back and retreat to your identity. I think about my grandfather. He's passed on now about 10 years ago, but he smoked a pipe. And everybody's like, you got to get rid of it. You can't smoke your pipe around the kids. And, everybody's like, people don't like it. And he just kept going back to it. And I started thinking, I'm like, that's his identity. He's known as like the crazy inventor with the pipe. Like that was like his identity. So if your identity is wrapped up in a certain way that you feel, or your identity is wrapped up in a certain disease, like, oh, I have Lyme disease. Okay, well, by you saying you have Lyme disease, you are Lyme disease. But what if you said, I have Lyme disease symptoms? Now that says that you're not Lyme disease. There's a very big distinction, right? Like, oh, I have hormonal problems. Okay, well, that's your identity because you're saying that. But what if you just said, I have a lot of hormonal symptoms right now, but that's not who I am? So I believe, Katherine, that our identity is one of those big things that holds people back. Now, clearly there's bad protocols, there's products that don't work, there's the order that you approach it in, like all that matters, and your mindset. But the identity piece is probably the cherry on top of like, well, am I going to get the same attention if I'm well versus if I'm sick? I mean, these are real questions to ask. Like, there's no way I'm thinking that. Like, well, really? Are you okay with being well and maybe your relationships will be different? Or did you not get attention as a kid and you got attention by, oh, my tummy hurts, oh, my head hurts, right? And now there's this unconscious thing that's ingrained of like, well, when I don't feel good, I get attention. And it's nothing personal as much as let's just open up the kimono and see, and let's clear all that out, because you are who you need to be when you're in optimum health. You're not who you need to be when you're in this state that you've created based on, symptoms that you're having.
When we're trying to make a shift in our lives, all it can take is one small thing to set us in the right direction. Perhaps for someone you know, it could be listening to this podcast. My hope is to get this into as many ears as possible. So if you know somebody that's stuck and needs to make a shift, why not send them this podcast? It could be the one thing that sets them in the right direction.
The shift!
As we move through this episode, you can see that there are so many different factors when it comes to the emotional side of health. What I'm wanting to do is to inspire you to begin to look at some of these deeper parts of yourself, to begin to become aware of why you do what you do and why you think how you think. In order to heal, the other thing that we require is vulnerability. We require vulnerability to be able to truly look at our stuff, to look at the places of ourselves where our most tender emotions lie. Chantelle Otten is a psychosexual therapist who helps people overcome all kinds of sexual dysfunction. You can't get much more uncomfortable than working in these realms, so I wanted to ask her what vulnerability meant for her.
Vulnerability for me is such a beautiful thing to be. Vulnerability means taking down your barriers and actually exposing your real self to someone else. And I really believe that in your relationships with everyone, you should feel safe to be vulnerable. Vulnerability also means taking accountability from my perspective. Accountability is something that I very much live by, and I always say to people, if you are not feeling good, come in, tell me that you're not in a great space. Tell your friends and your family members, hey, today I'm not feeling so good, or I'm having a bit of a rough time, or I'm just feeling a bit flat. That is being vulnerable. That is taking accountability for yourself. It's also helping others around you navigate the way that you are feeling and behaving, and being able to provide a level of support for you so you're able to get through that period of time.
We all want to be vulnerable, but we want to also control it too. We want to control the narrative and tell the story instead of allowing ourselves to be moved. And, the nature of who we are is, if you're stiff and rigid, you break. We all know that. That's when we fall down and break ourselves, and our minds break down a little bit when we're trying to control another person or ourselves. And when we're soft and movable, we have a more harmonious experience. We're able to relax and have that feeling where we're having a good conversation with a friend. We do feel safe. So vulnerability is able to pour out of us. We can't control the endpoint. And, the beauty is you can find out all this stuff, like a big remembering when you go outside and walk around. There's no endpoints in nature. You're moving into the direction that pulls your attention and, heading over to the tree that's most beautiful to you, but you're not thinking, oh, that tree next to it is less attractive than that other tree. It just seems ridiculous when we bring ourselves back to nature in that way, and then also remember our own nature. But yeah, absolutely. Everything around us is telling us a story of Sure, go ahead and be vulnerable if you can spin that into a success story, or be vulnerable if you can, get some points somehow for it. But for real, you better be able to control it and see that endpoint. Otherwise, it's not going to be safe.
That was Tara Stiles, founder of Strala Yoga. I love this conversation around the push and pull of this. We want to be vulnerable, but we also want to control the things in our lives because that's what we're used to doing. What I know from personal experience is that when there are deep-seated emotions driving our behaviours, it can be difficult to drop into that vulnerability. You will want to protect yourself from feeling these emotions so much that you'll find ways to suppress them and avoid looking at them at all costs. The end result of this, however, is that these emotions will need to be processed somehow, and often the end result is physical illness. Let's go deeper and look at shame. Shame is something that impacts so many of us. In my years of clinical practice, I've seen this show up for women so much. And if you're able to find ways to identify and release this emotion, it will have a huge impact on your life. I asked naturopath and intuitive healer Kate Reardon to explain what shame meant to her.
Shame is something I feel like we will all experience. I'm not scared of it, and I don't want to label it as something that is bad. It's a human experience. But shame cuts deep. It penetrates deep into our psyche because the voice of shame says, I am wrong. Not I did something wrong, that's guilt. I am wrong, that's shame. And we wear that in a different way. And what I mean by that is we blame ourselves. That's an internal battle of our psyche. And if you have these underlying wounds of I'm not good enough, I'm not pretty enough, I'm not rich enough, I'm not whatever enough, fill in the blank, then that shame just has a place to live. And if it's got a place to live in the narrative of your being, then you will feel it in some way, shape, or form on a day-to-day basis. And that's what's not okay. The experience of shame, totally normal, part of our human experience. The way that we process it is what really matters. And that's why we need to be reminded sometimes that we're okay, that we're enough, that just by existing and having a heart beating in the body that you have now that looks the way that it is now, that you are enough. You are love embodied itself. But it's up to us to learn, to remember, I guess, how to know that within ourselves. Not know it on a mental level, but embody that deeply into the depths so that that love and that self-acceptance is stronger than that shame.
You cannot shame your way into wellness. You cannot obsess your way into health. And so when I say you can't heal a body you hate, many people, let's just use fasting as an example, or any way of eating or fasting. It can be used for good or abused. And it's antithetical for sustainable health to use something like intermittent fasting as a form to punish yourself or, fast your way out of a poor diet. So I talk about that at length in intuitive fasting, that this is really not what I'm talking about at all. Sustainable wellness has to be born out of a grace and lightness, and using self-care as a form of self-respect, and instead of being super arduous and punitive and going to punish your body because you ate something that wasn't healthy and you're just going to starve yourself. This is not healthy. This is going to become an eating disorder disguised as a wellness practice, and that is not good. So people have to check their heads, check their hearts, and check their relationship with their body, check their relationship with food to really why they're doing these things. Because a healthy way of eating can be good or it can be abused. Flexible intermittent fasting can be good or it can be abused. Really anything. Exercise can be good or it can be abused. So I want there to be, instead of this, oh my gosh, I can't have all these things and those foods are bad and these are good and I just have to do this, but I'm really resenting it because I miss all these foods that aren't good for me. It's not about that. That's going to be the dieting consciousness that fails most people. Instead of really shifting your paradigm and having a full awareness shift to being, okay, this isn't about all the things I can't have. I can have whatever I want. I can have anything that I want. but I love feeling better more than I miss a food that makes me feel really lousy. And even if I go and eat the food that makes me feel really lousy, I'm not going to beat myself up. I'm actually going to use that food, that time of eating something that made me feel really lousy. I'm going to actually use that time to check in with my body, use it as a mindfulness practice to say, how did that serve me? How do I feel? Do I feel inflamed? How's my digestion? How's my energy levels? Do I feel fatigued? Be introspective and use it as an awareness exercise to see if it's worth it or not. And for some people, maybe it's a little bit of a flare or a little bit of an inflammation, a little bit of whatever, and it's okay. It's going to be fine. Then you don't beat yourself up and you eat it and move on. And you don't shame yourself or obsess yourself over what's gone. Or you may learn that was really not worth it. And I won't do that again, because it's not that I can't have it. It's that, no, I love feeling so good that I won't trade it in for feeling lousy. And as the person leans into that awareness of you can't heal a body you hate and growing into that practice of resonating from that place, you will have a grace and a lightness that will serve you, because it won't be about a diet. It won't be about a program. It'll just be about operating from a place of intuition. So that's what I mean by you can't heal a body you hate.
That was Dr. Will Cole again. I couldn't agree more. You can't heal a body you hate. Cultivating self-love is so important. When I see the patterns of self-sabotage in my patients, the first thing that I'm thinking about is what is in the way of them loving themselves enough to heal. Not feeling good enough, not feeling like you are enough, feeling unworthy. This is at the core of many other emotions, beliefs, and behaviours for women. I know this all too well, as a big part of my life was spent not feeling good enough, not feeling worthy enough. It took years of unpacking trauma around my parents, schooling, addiction, and many other facets in order for me to move through this. Not feeling good enough can show up as attracting crappy partners, working for horrible bosses, or not looking after yourself. It can show up as low motivation or recurring cycles in your life. Here's a story from Kate Reardon that shows what can happen when we don't feel like we're enough.
I think we hold on to narratives. And what I mean by narratives is storylines that have happened to us by experience. So, for example, when I first started practicing, I was a naturopath in a multi-modality clinic. So there was a chiropractor, an acupuncturist, massage therapist, etc. And I was the naturopath. On the very, very first day that I had to practice, so I'd been at university for 5 years, worked my butt off. My only dream was to be in a clinic and to see patients and to help and support people's well-being journeys. And I was so ecstatic to finally arrive at this moment. It was like my climbing the Everest and putting my flag in the top of the mountain moment. And I walked in the clinic that day and I couldn't believe it. I had tingles all over my body thinking, this is it, this is it, this is it. And before I even saw my first patient, I was nervous, but I was so excited, so ready. The chiropractor came in to give me a little pep talk. And he was a man that was probably he would have been about 25 years older than me. And he sat down and he said, look, I good luck today. I know it's your first day and I just want to tell you that, don't be too hard on yourself. And anyway, no one's going to listen to what you say anyway, because you're too young and you're too pretty. And then he walked out of the room and it completely floored me. Like, I was devastated. I was so like someone had just punctured me through the heart. And it wasn't like a big thing, but to me, it was a big thing. But what that hit inside of me was this core belief that I believed that I'm not good enough. And so when we look at creation and the way that our lives play out, I created that because I was believing that within myself. But it was just like wrapped up in this, picture of I've done it, I've got my certificate, I've gone to their thing and look at all these things that I've done and I'm here. And essentially a lot of what was driving me back then was this core belief to disprove that. So it happens in so many different ways, and it's really the only way that we can really understand it for ourselves, because my core wound of not being good enough is going to be different and play out differently to yours. It's constant self-inquiry and self-reflection. If we're not looking at how we behave, looking at conversations we've had, pattern recognition, having good solid friends that can call us out on our shit, if we're not willing to really go through and explore ourselves with this tendency of love and compassion, then we don't really know. We're just in the dark all the time. And it wasn't until years later and through a lot of self-inquiry and a lot of self-reflection that I could see, that girl in that clinic that day that was me, she didn't feel good enough. And so that's why that happened to me, to show her again, that this wound needs attention, needs some love.
There have been so many great insights in this episode, but I want to leave you with this. Your emotional health is just as important as your physical health. Your emotional landscape that makes you you is made up by your upbringing, past experiences, and beliefs about the world. Your emotions create thoughts, which create feelings, which create actions and behaviours. These actions and behaviours then determine how you interact with your external environment. What I know to be true from working with thousands of women is that you can heal if you believe that you can. You are enough. You are perfect just the way you are in this moment. You are not broken and you don't need to be fixed. What you do need is support and space to be held so that you can heal. So please build a support team around you. As women, this has always been important for us, so find your tribe and set the intention to build meaningful relationships with other women so that you can lean on each other. Seek therapists and healers that can assist you on your journey. You don't have to do this alone. Lastly, if you want a medium to look into some of these deeper parts of yourself, I'd suggest checking out our 8-week Mindshift program. It is hosted by our wonderful hypnotherapist and psychotherapist, Rebecca Ether, and it's a great resource for you to tap into the parts of yourself that can often get overlooked in the busy day-to-day. Go to the courses tab on theshiftclinic.com to find out more. In the next episode of The Shift, I'm going to take a look into fertility and what we need to do to enhance our own natural fertility.
Coming up on The Shift.
Fertility is a vital sign of female well-being.
I think the hardest part with fertility treatments is actually the mindset part of it.
It can take up to 9 months, sometimes up to 12 months for women to get pregnant after the pill.
Your body is very cleverly and intelligently protecting you. It's making a really wise decision that your body can't handle a pregnancy right now.
The likelihood of those things is lessened if you can go into pregnancy with a much more robust and healthy vaginal microbiome.
This series is a production of The Shift Clinic. Hosted by Katherine Maslen. Music and sound design by Shade Furlong. Thank you to all of our experts. For more details on them, go to theshiftclinic.com.
We can be. We must be.
The first generation to end extreme poverty.
The generation most determined to fight injustice
and inequality.
The generation that saves the planet
from climate change.
And this is how we will get it done.
The Global Goals. A 15-year plan for everyone, everywhere.
With no one left behind.
The Global Goals are a framework that collectively help us
support the health of our people
and the planet.
At Shift, we are ambassadors for the Global Goals.
This project supports Global Goal number 6.
Clean water and sanitation.
Every time you listen
to an episode of The Shift,
we provide a day's access to clean water
for a human in need
in Malawi, Africa.
Water is the foundation to health, and we believe
every human should have access
to clean, healthy water.
So please share this podcast wide
and keep tuning in
so we can impact those who need it the most.